Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about a minute. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Rhonda Ortiz with the USC Equity Research Institute, formerly the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, and I promise I will stop saying that very soon. We are happy to join. We're happy that you all could join us for the second annual event to talk about how immigrants are faring in Los Angeles County, both through the data and our report that we're releasing today that we're so excited about, and also through the many experts in the field that you all will hear from over the next 3 days. But to get us started, building from our State of Immigrants in Los Angeles County report, or SOILA, that served, last year's report served as the baseline. And this year we have the 2021 version, and I'm excited to introduce my colleagues, Manuel Pastor, who's the director of the USC Equity Research Institute, and Cynthia Moreno, who is one of our data analysts. They are gonna walk us through some of the points of the report, but I do recommend that you head over to our website to see the full 100+ page report, which is amazing, and I'm totally not biased. And really quickly, before I turn it to them, I just want to thank the following people: Dalia Gonzalez, Carolina Otero, Emma Udelovich, Jeffrey Jang, Sabrina Kim, Tylay, Sarah Balcha, Justin Scoggins, and of course, Manuel and Cynthia. She led the project and wrote a lot of it as well, but both of them all contributed to this amazing report. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Manuel Pastor, and I'll be walking our way through the report. So a couple things. This is our second annual State of Immigrant in Los Angeles. We said that each year we would pick up a new theme. Who was to know that COVID would wind up being the theme, but it's going to be the theme. And you can see here that we've got immigrants masked, as they should appropriately be in the public health circumstances that we're talking about. Second thing I wanted to say is if you want to see all of the graphics in full display, you might want to go to the bottom right of your little window there and open it up full bore so that you've got a full screen. You can see the graphs in full screen. For those of you who like it, data and numbers, full screen is the way to go. For those of you who don't like data and numbers, we don't get you. We don't understand you, because we love data and numbers. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. In our introduction, what I'd like to do is to remind you that we define immigrant integration as consisting of sort of 3 separate pillars: economic mobility for, civic participation by, and receiving society openness to immigrants, which we call the latter warmth of welcome. This is a definition of immigrant integration that is measurable, that has got nothing to do with cultural assimilation or change, and in fact is two-way in the sense of immigrants making their way in U.S. society and society itself in the United States wanting to change to be much more welcoming. Another thing that we insisted on last year in January, before this became something even far more profoundly recognized by the rest of the United States, is the need to place immigrant integration within the larger fight for racial justice, something that became absolutely clear this year as a result of the murder of George Floyd and the community reaction to shift toward reimagining public safety. But it was clear as well in the COVID crisis and the racial inequalities that were there, but even in the last 4 years of othering, racialization, xenophobia on the part of the Trump administration. Why do we insist that racial justice is central to immigrant integration? Anti-immigrant sentiment is driven by racial anxiety. The way in which people are othered and marginalized who are immigrants is very much tied to anti-Black racism in this country, anti-Indigenous racism in this country, and the way that that constitutes othering and marginalization. We also know that the systems that are used to oppress immigrants are deeply tied to the systems that oppress Black and Indigenous folks in this country. And finally, we want to make sure that when we think about immigrant integration, we want to not have it be jumping into the middle class, that is economic mobility that hopscotches over the situation of oppressed groups, particularly African Americans and other groups in the United States, but rather seeks a model of immigrant integration rooted in racial and economic justice that seeks to lift everyone at the same time. So what did 2020 reveal to us? Take it away, Cynthia.
Okay, will do. Thank you for that, Manuel. And so thank you to all of you for being with us today. We'll dive right into a conversation on what 2020 revealed or emphasized to us, starting with the fact that COVID-19 hit a county with a large immigrant population. 1 in every 3 Los Angeles residents are immigrants. And many of us who have lived in Los Angeles County for any extended amount of time know how important and expansive immigrant communities are to this region. However, with the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, there now exists a renewed urgency to understand who in our county has been and continues to be most vulnerable to both sickness and a lack of support. And so of the total population in LA County, which is about 10 million people, a whole 35% are immigrants, which equates to about 3.5 million residents. 8% of the population is undocumented. And not only are there a lot of immigrants in the county, but they're all over the place. In each county supervisorial district, immigrants make up at least 30% of residents, and in some districts, that number rises much higher. Additionally, they're not only in big LA County cities, such as the city of Los Angeles, but they're in the suburbs, north and east of here. In places like Rosemead, Rowland Heights, Monterey Park, and San Gabriel, immigrants actually comprise over 54% of residents. But while our current population is large, it has actually already peaked and leveled off. In the 1970s and 80s, 1/4 of all immigrants that came into the United States came through LA County, which contributed to the large population growth in those decades in particular. Growth continued steadily up until 2000, but between 2010 and 2018, immigrant numbers have actually decreased slightly. Part of that means that the undocumented community in LA has been here for quite a long time, even more so than the lawful permanent resident group as seen in the middle bar here. 70% of the undocumented Angelenos have been in the US for more than a decade. And we highlight this both to combat the myth that immigrants are newcomers and have no ties to community, and also because length of residency affects eligibility and the likelihood of naturalization, just as one example of what residency can mean for an immigrant. In recent months, it may also have been an important indicator to establish connections and what they could bring to immigrant life in both receiving information and aid about the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at immigration status by race and ethnicity, we see why many people may assume that immigration is a Latino or Asian American issue. Latinos do comprise 55% of immigrants in LA, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders make up 28%. On the right, we see those numbers divided by type of immigration status. However, focusing on these breakdowns alone invisibilizes the fact that other communities, such as Black residents of both California and Los Angeles County, a significant proportion of them are immigrants or the second generation descendants of immigrants. And so while only a small share of immigrants in LA County are Black, that doesn't necessarily mean that immigration is not important to the Black Angeleno experience, because it is. Now, if Manuel were giving this presentation on this particular slide, this is where he would mention that there are more Issa Raes in LA County than we might imagine. And that's just, I think her dad is an immigrant. So that is all to say that there are Black immigrants and descendants of Black immigrants all around us. They are integral to the discussion of immigration in this county and should be acknowledged as such. Among all Black Angelenos, 10% are immigrants, and an additional 9% are the US-born children of immigrants. This equates to almost 1 in 5 Black Angelenos. In our full report, if you all are interested, we detail the ancestry of Black immigrants as well as immigrants of other races. But as a summary, Black immigrants in LA County are largely from Nigeria, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Belize, and Jamaica. And so that's the context that COVID-19 entered. The numbers that are displayed here are as of May 25th, 2021. And COVID-19, as many of us here already know, disproportionately impacted communities of color, both in case rates on the left, namely Pacific Islanders of our communities, and death rates that affected all communities of color pretty strongly, specifically, again, Pacific Islanders, Latino, and Black Angelenos. Although the Los Angeles Department of Public Health doesn't collect data on nativity and immigration status, and that's where this data is from, knowing what we know about our communities of color in LA County, and also reflecting on our lived experiences, we know that immigrants are largely represented in these numbers. And it's for that reason that our presentation and our full report aims to highlight how COVID-19 now colors the state of immigrants in LA County. And we attempt to honor the lives represented in these numbers here. There are a myriad of reasons why these numbers are what they are and why they're as high as they are for our communities. And I'll hand it to Manuel to dive into those specifics.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And I would note that if I had been presenting that slide, I would have mentioned Issa Rae for sure, but also Nipsey Hussle. I mean, girl, you're slipping. So let me take a look at, we'll try to explain why COVID hit the immigrant community so hard. This is a chart that tries to take a look at workers classified by whether or not they're in essential occupations, meaning occupations that in industries that continued to work during the pandemic, grocery store clerks, healthcare, truck drivers, a number of others, and whether or not in those essential industries it's called high risk, which in the context of COVID was high contact, meaning lots of contact with people at work. And one of the things that you'll notice here, the red bars are the high contact and essential occupations, is that Black, Latino, and Asian American immigrant and Pacific Islander immigrant workers over-indexed in the kind of work where they continue to go to work, have lots of contacts with people, and wind up having a high risk of getting COVID. If you look at those sort of tan bars that are right next to the red bars, those are what are called non-essential high-risk work. Now, it feels terrible when somebody says that your work is non-essential. Of course, I'm an academic, and we are really the epitome of being non-essential. But non-essential work was work that could shut down. That was restaurants, retail, hospitality. That was higher risk, meaning it was high proximity. A lot of the non-essential low-risk work, actually like being an academic or being a manager of a hedge fund, could still be done by Zoom. But for the non-essential high-risk work, restaurants, retail, hospitality, couldn't happen, was subject to the stop and go, and wound up having a lot of job losses and a lot of income losses. And you can see here that Black folks, Latino, and immigrant, in particular Pacific Islanders and Asians, were over-indexed in this non-essential higher risk work. What does that mean? It means that communities of color, particularly immigrants, were far more likely to contract the disease at work and run that kind of health risk, but also far more likely to lose jobs or income and run that kind of economic risk, hit on both sides of the COVID pandemic. Women in particular were hard hit, and this was something already occurring on a landscape of gender inequality in terms of wages, particularly for immigrant women. if you look here, it tries to break down pay rates by both gender and whether or not U.S. born or immigrant. And you can see that with the exception of the BA degree in particular, well, there women are behind men. There continues to be significant sexism in labor markets, even at the highly educated end. But you can see that in particular for the high school diploma, less than high school, that immigrant women had the lowest paid jobs. And they also had the jobs that were the most at risk of being shut down. And you see this in the unemployment data, where increasingly economists are talking about a she-recession because it's affected women so much in terms of the occupations that they were in, and also in terms of the collapse of childcare and schools, which actually also had a big impact on immigrant women as well. Immigrants were also more likely to be in low wage and insecure jobs. This breaks jobs pre-pandemic into jobs that were making at least $15 an hour. This is for full-time year-round work, and jobs that were making less than $15 an hour. What you can see here is for jobs making at least $15 an hour, 62% of that group was U.S. born. A much smaller share was lawful permanent residents or undocumented. But for the group making less than $15 an hour, 24% undocumented, 17% lawful permanent residents. And this is for full-time year-round work. If you look at part-time work, immigrants over-concentrated in that as well. So very much at risk from the economic consequences of the pandemic. And you can see this then when you look at the proportion of immigrants living in poverty who are therefore most vulnerable to the economic turndown. This is the poverty level, as you may know, is defined as the emergency food diet times 3 and adjusted for family size. Very unrealistic in a high-cost location like Los Angeles. So for a family of 4, the official poverty level is about $24,000, which isn't just poor, that's like super poor. So economists increasingly use a measure of economic insecurity 200% of the federal poverty level. And you can see here that 63% of undocumented Angelenos were falling below that measure of economic insecurity, 48% of lawful permanent residents, and both of those much higher than what it is for the U.S. born or for naturalized citizens. This also has a distinct racial breakdown. If you look at this, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the Black immigrant experience is doing a little bit better than the Black U.S. born in Los Angeles, but that there's a commonality between Black people and immigrants in Los Angeles County with regard to the level of economic insecurity that exists. One of the things that you might have noticed looking at those charts was that Asians looked like they were faring a little bit better in terms of household income. But the challenge with this is that one absolutely needs to disaggregate every population. And in the report, you'll note that Cynthia, for example, when she mentioned Black immigrants, disaggregated by ancestry. The report tries to do that along a number of different dimensions. And you should dive into the report because disaggregation is important. And because it has about 45,000 graphs. I mean, it's amazing. But what we tried to do too, in particular, is disaggregate the Asian population, Asian immigrant population, because that experience is so different. So this is median household income for AAPI immigrants, and you can see very low median household incomes for Pakistani, Korean, Cambodian, Bengali, Thai, and it's higher when you start looking at South Asian Indian, Filipino, Sri Lankan, etc. So it's important to disaggregate every experience. It's particularly important to disaggregate the Asian American experience. And you'll see that later on, we actually also try to disaggregate the indigenous immigrant experience. That is folks who are immigrated into this country who are actually indigenous folks from the countries from which they hail. Another reason why COVID was so hard hitting in the immigrant community, overcrowding. What this chart tries to do is to say, let's look at the documentation status of the householder, the so-called head of household, and the people who live in that household. 24% of people living in a household headed by an undocumented immigrant were living in overcrowded housing. which is defined by the census as more than 1.5 people living per room. And that's, by the way, counting bedrooms, and not just bedrooms, but also living rooms and kitchens, etc. So this is really a good measure of overcrowding. Overcrowded as well were LPRs, lawful permanent residents, naturalized citizens, and very low for the U.S. born. What does this mean? When you think about what we were talking about before, you had people running high risk at work, but then when they go home, they're in much more overcrowded conditions. So whatever disease they might pick up at work, they're much more likely to communicate across their household. And that's one of the reasons why we saw such high case rates, in particular for the Pacific Islander and Latino communities. Now, that's not the only thing that the COVID crisis brought. It was also made very evident the digital divide. In the literature that works on digital divide, being on the wrong side of the digital divide is defined as not having in your household a combination of a computer and a laptop and high-speed internet. It's, by the way, not just high-speed internet, because if you've ever tried to do your homework on one of these, you understand that you do need a computer or a laptop. And the heroic efforts of so many schools, districts, including the one that my wife heads, Lawndale Elementary School District. Hi, wife. That the heroic efforts that they did to make sure that kids had hotspots and Chromebooks, really important. But at the same time, it's much more difficult to do your homework unless you've got a laptop computer and, of course, connection to high-speed internet that not everyone is crowding in on. And what you can see is that 50% of undocumented Angelenos are on the wrong side of the digital divide. 37% of lawful permanent residents. It's about 30% for U.S. born and naturalized citizens. A lot of those are seniors who are a little bit disconnected in terms of digital access. What's really important is to take a look at the K12 students by immigrant household type. And what you can see here is there was a big disparity in terms of immigrant parent households with their kids not being able to get as much access to remote learning and quality of remote learning. Again, great efforts on the part of schools, teachers, principals, etc., to try to address these divides, but they're deeply baked into our society. There's something that we really need to address, and it's one of the reasons why COVID has had such a big impact on health, on wealth, and on learning. Now, now there's a lot of folks who tried to respond to this. We profile in the report so many different groups that did great work to try to respond with services. For example, the South Asian Network trying to provide economic assistance to folks in the South Asian community, Legal Aid Foundation of LA, Unite LA as well. And another thing that reared its ugly head during the COVID crisis was not just the structural racism that's reflected in the disparities that we just talked about in terms of data, but racism in terms of hate. And so we saw a huge increase in anti-Asian hate. And of course, the rise of efforts to try to stop that and have us address the way in which people in U.S. society yank back the warmth of welcome and instead go to the handbook of xenophobia and hate as a playbook that is fanned by political leaders, but one that is deep in the hearts of so many people and needs to be addressed at that level as well as at a leadership level. Let's turn things over to Cynthia to talk about what lessons we need to take away from this moment of reckoning.
Yes, thank you, Manuel. So knowing all that 2020 brought to us, there are lessons that we would like to take with us into our collective recovery, starting with the fact that there are many, many mixed status families in LA County. So, excluding immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, from pandemic-related aid has drastic ripple effects for this region. As you can see here on the chart, there are about 800,000 undocumented immigrants in the county alone that are directly impacted from being excluded from federal aid. There's an additional about 800,000 citizens living with undocumented family, and over 250,000 LPRs living with undocumented family. That amounts to about 18% of the county. And so excluding the undocumented in this county impacts many more people than just the undocumented community. And it also affects their children. Out of all Latino children under the age of 18, 32% live with at least one undocumented parent. And the same is true for about 13% of Asian American children. Yet another lesson to take with us is lacking health insurance coverage within immigrant communities and the public health risks that that poses for us all. As you can see in the chart, about 7% of naturalized citizens in LA County lack health insurance coverage. That percentage increases significantly for lawful permanent residents at about 22%, and even more dramatically for undocumented Angelinos at over 42%, who were lacking health insurance coverage before the pandemic began. Another lesson to take with us, as Manuel alluded to earlier, is the need to acknowledge the existence of and address the needs of Indigenous migrants in our region. Data on Indigenous migrants is finally emerging in the field, and that is wholly due to the efforts of Indigenous migrants themselves. The data you see here was gathered by SOILA, an Indigenous-led community organization in Los Angeles that both provides services and collects their own data on those that they serve. We're actually fortunate enough to have SOILA's co-founder and executive director joining us later today for a discussion on this. And their work fills a gaping hole in the ecosystem of immigrant-minded research and institutions. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the organization quickly pivoted to providing funds to support their communities when they were left out of receiving federal aid. As you can see on the screen here, SOILA's data highlights that LA County is much more diverse than many of us may even realize. And Indigenous migrants too must be included in our collective recovery from the pandemic. Of those served by their program in the last year, 74% identified as Indigenous Zapotec, followed by Indigenous Mixe at 12%. Though, as you can see, there's a running list of migrants from other Indigenous groups that call Los Angeles County home. A related issue to the recognition of Indigenous migrants is language access. A linguistically isolated household is defined as one in which no member aged 14 or older speaks English at least very well. Efforts and services to promote English learning and multilingual outreach and services are needed for immigrants of all statuses and backgrounds. However, as you can see, the data reveals that concerted efforts may be needed to reach the undocumented community in particular, given that 40% of undocumented-led households are linguistically isolated. When we disaggregate this data by our common racial and ethnic categories, we find that 33% of Asian American immigrant households are linguistically isolated. This is followed by 29% of Latino immigrant households. That's about 1 in 3 households for those two communities. Though it should be noted that in the Latino bar depicted here, it often invisibilizes the Indigenous migrants just mentioned earlier, as they're often lumped into or can be lumped into the Latino category and thus erasing their specific and individual needs. Additionally, we wanted to highlight the bar on the far left, showing that 24% of white immigrant households are also linguistically isolated. It may seem surprising to some, I know it definitely was for me, but the county is actually home to nearly 500,000 white immigrants, including over a quarter of immigrants that are Middle Eastern or North African, otherwise known as MENA. Oddly enough, the census currently doesn't have a MENA category, but instead categorizes those who identify as MENA as white. In the full report, we break out the MENA ancestry as well, which is how we were able to connect these 2 points. We should also note that there has been dedicated organizing and advocacy to get a MENA category added to the census, and we believe that accomplishing this would be a step to preventing further invisibilization of certain immigrants and experiences. And of course, another lesson that we must take with us moving forward is that hate crimes continue to be a serious concern for many, as Manuel spoke of earlier. However, I want to emphasize the fact that the data depicted here was gathered in 2019, so it was before pandemic era increases in hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So as you can see, even before the rise we witnessed last year, almost half of all hate crimes committed in 2019 were motivated by bias towards the victim's race, ethnicity, or national origin, pointing to an ongoing issue that we must address. It's important to note that the vast majority of such crimes also go unreported and due part to the victim's own fears of retaliation or due to a vulnerable identity, such as a lack of citizenship status. And one last lesson to take away with us that we wanted to really drive home is that state and local governments must work in partnership with trusted community organizations that proactively distributed resources and support to their communities during a time of immense crisis. Despite having limited resources, limited capacity, and also while enduring the same painful impacts of COVID-19. It's their leadership and the leadership of their members that will ensure a more equitable recovery and future for our region. And now to talk more about our future, I'll pass it back to Manuel.
So what does this mean for our future? A couple of things we want to lift up and then 10 key lessons that are in the report. One is it's become quite clear about worker vulnerability in this crisis. I know that April Verrett, I'm sure, will talk about this in the panel discussion. This is the median hourly wage by nativity and immigration status. This is looking at it also by race and immigration status. But you can see here that Black workers, Latino workers, particularly Latino immigrant workers, really facing difficult and vulnerable conditions as workers, and implementing the kind of worker protections that emerged during COVID, where folks fought for health councils at the workplace, fought to get emergency pay, et cetera. All of the things are important, and worker protection should be a permanent feature of the Los Angeles immigrant integration landscape. A second thing that's really important to understand is small businesses. Small businesses got hard hit by the COVID economic downturn, and in particular, these tend to be businesses owned by people of color, particularly immigrants. And you could see this because of the way in which for each and every ethnic group, the rate of self-employment, business startup, is actually higher for immigrants than it is for non-immigrants within each one of those groups. So whatever we do to promote small business development and small business survival, absolutely key to the immigrant community. We also need to increase immigrant political voice. And one of the biggest things that we should be doing is to promote naturalization. If you look at these naturalization rates, these are for people who are eligible to naturalize, meaning that they're lawful permanent residents that have been in the country for a sufficient amount of time that they could naturalize. And yet, for Latinos, it's only 60%, 59% of Latinos who are eligible to naturalize who have not yet naturalized. That is latent political voice that could actually raise the kind of issues, raise political attention to the kind of issues that we've presented in this report and that you will hear throughout this summit. Now, focusing in on naturalization doesn't mean abandoning the undocumented population. We need to continue to do work like the LA Justice Fund to support people getting representation, to prevent them from being removed from unfair deportation procedures in which there's no right to legal representation. This is from a project that we did looking at the LA Justice Fund, and what you can see here is for immigrants that had no legal representation, 77% were given a removal order. For those who had legal representation, only 18%. Legal representation makes a difference. These groups probably had literally pretty close to the same kinds of cases, but they didn't have the representation. We need to double down at both the city and county level on the kind of work represented by the LA Justice Fund. And all of this means supporting the community-based organizations that have really done the work, as Cynthia was talking about in her part of the presentation. Groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Trans-Latina Coalition, etc., who've been working hard to make sure that immigrants and their needs get represented. So how do we tie this all together? I think I have 2 minutes and 10 points, so I'm going to speak fast. First thing that we really want to raise, we're going to give you the top 10 list of things that you should be thinking about moving forward. We often end with 3 because, at least as a lapsed Catholic, I think of everything in terms of 3s, but we also think about David Letterman and top 10 lists. So first thing that we would insist on, we need to center racial justice in the immigrant integration agenda. And that means addressing anti-Blackness within the immigrant community and within the larger society, because it is that anti-Black racism that sets the contours for marginalization, for disappearance, etc. Anti-Indigenous as well, but in this moment, really lining up to make sure that we address anti-Black racism within the immigrant community and within our own immigrant organizations, as well as within the broader society, absolutely crucial. Second, we need to tailor resources and services to immigrant communities in linguistically and culturally appropriate manner. This is something, of course, that Cynthia was talking about. We need to continue to address the COVID crisis and understand that when people emerge from this crisis, they will have been damaged physically, they will have been damaged economically, and particularly in the immigrant community, there'll be lots of mental health trauma because of the loss of lives, the loss of family members, the way in which the community got ravaged and basically underappreciated by the government, and a number of other things. There's going to be so much mental health issues that we're going to need to address in communities that, as we know, frequently don't access mental health services because they're not culturally responsive, because they're not placed in the community. We need to make sure that the COVID vaccine is widely accessible in immigrant and people of color communities. We need to understand the housing crisis and the need to continue to provide rent relief, cash assistance, and food security. People are not just going to emerge out of this unscathed. There will have been tremendous economic damage. We need, as I mentioned, to protect Angelino immigrants from deportation and detention and provide representation for those in deportation proceedings. We need, as I mentioned, to protect worker rights and promote robust labor engagement in the efforts for immigrant integration, but also robust business engagement, because business depends on immigrant laborers and immigrant integration is everyone's business. We need, particularly philanthropy, to continue to lead on immigrant integration through providing the kind of flexible and transparent funding that allows that community-based organizations to do the job of providing services and representing the community voice. We're researchers. Everyone needs to invest in extensive and diverse data collection. If you didn't, we wouldn't have a life. We wouldn't have a purpose. And we wouldn't have been able to make this, we hope, excellent presentation. And then finally, our central message is about building community power. If you want to change the contours and context for immigrant integration in Los Angeles County, it is crucial to present the kind of data that we did just now. It is crucial for policymakers and decision makers to step up. But that is only going to happen when data is put in the hands of community organizers and social movement organizations that can shift the balance of power. And by shifting the balance of power, ensure that our public officials need to pay attention to this issue, that we build alliances with labor, that we build alliances across ethnic communities and center racial justice, that we build alliances with business and alliances with philanthropy, and ensure that we continue to lead as a region on immigrant integration and try to lead on economic and racial justice. And with that, thank you, and back to Rhonda and what we hope and know will be an excellent panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Manuel and Cynthia. Let's everyone, big round of applause. I'll do it for myself. Woo! I hope everyone is applauding where you are right now. Wow, that was just such a wealth, rich, important data and so much wonderful disaggregated data. It's so important for all of us to have a full picture of who we are here in LA, and so important to do this with the racial justice lens. Folks, I'm so proud of our team and so proud of this work. And I hope this will serve as a kind of backdrop as we hear from many people over the next few days, really situating the data in their work and communities across all sectors, because as we have just seen, like, immigrants truly are the fabric of LA. So yes, thank you so, so much. I will now turn to our amazing, illustrious panel that I am so honored that I get to be able to share this virtual space with. I'm not gonna go into full introduction with their full bios. They each have a wealth of experience and so much expertise. And I'm pretty sure you can find their bios on the Socio platform. There's an area for that, so please go and check it out. You can see on the screen now that I have with me April Verrett, the president of SEIU Local 2015, Martha Arevalo, the executive director of CARECEN, or the Central American Resource Center, Shiu-Ming from the director of movement building and strategic partnerships with the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, and Lian Chun, with the executive director of Khmer Girls in Action. So I'm so happy to have you all here. I'm just gonna go ahead and open it up. We have only about 30 minutes together, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Before I open it up though, I just wanna make sure folks know in the audience that you are, go ahead and put in any chat if you wanna interact with the conversation. If you have any questions, put them in there and we'll get to them after the presentations. So April, I'm gonna, the same questions to everybody, but we're gonna open it up with April. How is this data that you just saw resonating with your experience on the ground with the people and the sector that you work in? And or throughout this report, we've focused on really connecting immigrant integration with the need to challenge anti-Black racism. So how has your own work intersected or connected with immigrant integration and the movement for racial justice? So you can touch on one or both. So the data from the report that resonates, or how your work is connecting with racial justice.
Sure. Thank you, Rhonda. So first of all, thanks everyone for asking me to be here for this really, really important conversation. And thank you, Cynthia and Manuel. What an amazing job you all did presenting the data. And for someone who's not a data nerd, like I was able to totally understand it. To the question, I would be remiss if, Manuel forecasted this. I did not lift up how low-wage workers, particularly low-wage immigrant workers and women, were situated in this report. And I think we really need to pay attention to low-wage women immigrants as we rebuild our economy, and I think go beyond where we are now. There's been a hell of a lot of talk over the last year. We've used a lot of buzzwords like equity, like essential workers, like the status quo, right? And so if we are really going to center low-wage women workers who are immigrants, we have to learn how to practice equity, right? We can't just talk about it, but we have to practice equity. If we really want to honor the sacrifices of essential workers, we can't just talk about it. Like, we need to change policies that actually do something to make change. If we really want to not go back to the status quo, again, we need to have real policies that don't uphold the status quo. And so in this moment, I believe we have a window of opportunity that is going to close on us if we don't find ways to keep that window open, and dare I say open it more, but really extract every single thing that we can around, I think, systemic structural change, right? That is the only way we really honor these workers. That's the only way we center women, we center immigrants. That's the only way we really change and build toward equity. I represent a union that is predominantly women of color, largely immigrant, right? I see my members in every single, frame of that report, every single slide in the deck. And at my union, we are trying to not be our grandfather's union, our grandmother's union. The moment calls for something different. Post-COVID, in this 21st century, we have to reach for something different. Right? We don't even know how to engage low-wage, untraditional workers. Like, we have to develop new toolkits to be able to do that. We have to, as a labor movement, as a movement of folks who want to seek justice, we have to all become anti-racist individuals, and we have to build anti-racist institutions. And yes, I believe we have to do that centering anti-Blackness. And so the report resonated deeply with me. I could go on, but I'll stop there. But we really have to learn how to practice and build new muscle if we're gonna win equity for the immigrants and for the women and for the workers that we're all talking about. And and I must say part of that is creating a pathway to the union, pathway to be able to build power for these workers who have been left out of so many settings, like the labor movement. So thank you.
Thank you, April. I'm going to turn it to Martha. Same questions. Data from the report that's resonating for you and your communities, and how your work connects with immigrant integration and the movement for racial justice.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us at this very important event. The data was amazing. Can't wait to really dive into the full report. I think that every single slide resonated tremendously. I think there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. I think for us, which I think I saw over and over again in the slides, it was very clear through the pandemic and the crisis that we are the safety net for the undocumented populations, for the immigrant populations. We are the place and the space where undocumented populations and the immigrant families go to in a moment of crisis for information, for resources, for assistance, for support, for connection to other resources and services. They don't necessarily go to the county or to the city. We have to understand that this is a community, like Dr. Pastor said, that has had a lot of trauma. We were just coming out of the last year of the previous administration that caused a lot of trauma and fear among immigrants. And then the pandemic hit, which also created a lot of trauma, for our community, a lot of isolation for our community. And so they would go to CARECEN, they would go to other sister organizations. And even though CARECEN and other sister organizations have been there every step of the way, crisis after crisis, I think that for us, it was just at another level in terms of realization of the role that we play in this community, in the county at large. And I think that for us, one of the biggest lessons is that we really have to dedicate a significant part of our work in the coming months, in the coming years, to pushing our local elected officials, our county officials, our city officials, to understand that we are their partners in delivering these critical services and this critical support to the most vulnerable community, and that they need to invest. They need to invest in our community. They need to invest in our organizations. They need to invest in programs like the LA Justice Fund, and really understand, I think as a community at large, that even though we're in Los Angeles, we still have a lot of work to be done. We still have to jump over so many hoops to get less than $10 million for the LA Justice Fund. And I think that the LA Justice Fund, for example, is just one example that it should be a no-brainer for LA County, should be a no-brainer for the city of Los Angeles. But still, there's many, many challenges, even amongst our champions, in terms of the level of scrutiny and hoops that we have to jump through. And so I think that those investments really need to happen. They can't happen as a one-time shot. It can't be just a year of the pandemic. It really has to be a long-term investment, because we're going to have other crises. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have future, pandemics and future similar crises where we need to be ready to respond and to have that rapid response arm really muscular and ready to go when necessary. I think the other lesson for us that we saw, and I know that you talked about it in the report, is about the digital divide. But the digital divide is bigger than I ever imagined. Even among our staff, most of our staff is college educated, and we found out that about 20% of our staff didn't have Wi-Fi at home. And so we had to provide hotspots for our staff to be able to do their work. And I figured if that's among our staff, I can only imagine what is happening in our community. And when people don't have access to technology and Wi-Fi and all of that, they are excluded from everything. We saw in the pandemic that you could only access vaccines online to make appointments. So we had to make appointments for our community members out of CARECEN. We couldn't access testing. You had to make an appointment via online. So we had to do that for our community. You couldn't order food to be delivered to your home unless you could do it online. Medical care, it was all video and online. And so our community was excluded from a lot because of this lack of, of resources and technology. And I think that we really have to become advocates to really lessen that technology divide. And there's so many other things. The report was great, but those are kind of two big things that resonated for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, it's so important to think about not only like just who we're thinking of the community, but our workers, our staff members, everybody. So many are part of immigrant communities too. So thank you so much. I'm going to now turn it over to Shiu-Ming. Same questions. You can touch on either both or data from the report that's resonating and or how your work is connecting immigrant integration and racial justice. Thank you.
All right, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to be part of this dialogue. I think a couple of points I wanted to raise is that, over the last few years, we've really been called as an immigrant rights movement to really redefine the goals and the framework that we're working within. So no longer limiting our goal or our North Star to just saying we want citizenship or quote unquote equality, when historically that's meant assimilating into a white norm, and when we know that many Black citizens continue to be oppressed and to face killings. And so I think we as a movement are really changing our North Star to say that we need to actively dismantle white supremacy and redefine what justice looks like. And part of what I've seen in terms of my work and broader shifts is that, for many years we've been pushing back against systems like detention and deportation, pushing back against law enforcement entanglement with ICE, looking actively at defunding those systems as a way to really diminish them, and now really connecting the dots and going much more into the divest invest framework and making sure that we also talk about divesting from other harmful institutions such as policing and carceral institutions. So really making sure that we're connecting the dots around these different systems of oppression that are really intertwined and impact people of color. And the other half of the divest invest framework is making sure, as you all have spoken about in your report, that we invest in communities of color, whether that's providing housing, healthcare, or cash assistance. Another piece I think is really important is making sure that immigration policies and programs don't actively perpetuate racial injustice. Marta talked about the importance of the LA Justice Fund, and many of us have been fighting for years to make sure that people who are in detention and who are facing deportation have attorneys by their side. As Cynthia Moreno mentioned, this is a pressing issue that is just continuing given the rise in deportations from 2018 to 2019. So over time, advocates have really shifted the way that we even talk about the Justice Fund and universal representation, where initially we really focused on it as an issue about courts and an issue of due process. And now we're really talking about it within the larger context of racial justice and what racial justice looks like in the immigration system, especially when we know that Black immigrants are disproportionately represented in removal proceedings and also receive higher bonds. And so the problem right now that we're seeing, though, is that the LA Justice Fund currently excludes immigrants with particular criminal convictions from being able to receive services. And so it's important that we don't compound the criminalization of BIPOC folks through these types of criminal carve-outs when we already know that the existing criminal legal system is rife with racial inequities. So we should instead look at the Justice Fund and other immigrant rights issues through a lens of how communities of color have historically and currently been targeted, surveilled, and funneled into the criminal and deportation systems. And so if we really want to move forward as a city, as a county, as a region, and on a larger scale, we need to make sure that we don't replicate unjust exclusions through the very programs that we're seeking to promote. So we should instead make sure that we really model and demonstrate a real commitment to racial justice that centers Black immigrants and communities. And I've also been very heartened over the last few years to see that immigrant rights groups are working much more closely with groups that are also challenging mass incarceration and policing. So it's really this type of intersectional movement building, intersectional work that I think is going to bring us forward as a region and make sure that we have justice for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are frozen on my end. I hope I'm not frozen. Can folks see me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Shiu-Ming. Yes, these are such important intersections that we need to take into consideration as we're developing policies. Leanne, I'm going to turn to you. Also, what is resonating with you from this report, and how are you in your work in Long Beach with My Girls really connecting with the movement for racial justice?
Awesome. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes. So, yeah, absolutely. That report and the data are wow. So much is resonating with me, and I first want to thank the research team for disaggregating some of the API data where it was possible, because oftentimes Southeast Asian experiences are hidden under the larger umbrella. So thank you for that. And as folks are talking and just hearing some of the challenges, like I really see essentially this is racialized capitalism at work. So much of what is happening in our community and so much of the challenges and the barriers that have emerged is because of how much the current system is failing so many of our folks and our people. And Martha mentioned earlier about just the expansive mutual aid that many of our organizations had to kind of, just assume and worked on, because the local organization oftentimes are the social and political lifeline for many of our community members. And we have definitely experienced that and seen that, during this pandemic. And I want to mention particularly for a lot of our young people, there are, a lot of our young people when the pandemic hit, particularly the transitional age youth and some of the high school students, given the multi-generational household that young people live in, many of them ended up having to think about how to support their family because folks were starting to lose their jobs. And a lot of young people ended up trying to take on additional work and not doing distance learning properly. And some of them temporarily dropping out of school to support their family and try to figure out ways to support their family. We were working a lot with a lot of our young people around some of these challenges. A lot of the gender role also became really pronounced during the pandemic. We have a lot of young women, a lot of young folks who ended up taking on additional responsibilities at home while their parents are trying to figure out work and trying to figure out how to, stay in a more, how to figure out how to be in a more stable situation amidst all of the challenges that have been going on. We work in Central Long Beach, and in Central Long Beach have some of the highest rental housing density. And amidst a lot of the inflation and some of the gentrification that's been going on, we have also seen a lot of some out-migration of our families and community members and in the time of the pandemic. So it was really worrisome. Many of our elders and our parents' generation are dealing with chronic conditions from war, from forced migration, and also from the genocide. And so there's been just a lot of additional challenges and chronic stress that folks have been dealing with. And I think that, post-pandemic, we're also going to be dealing with a lot of the compounded trauma that's going to be emerging from this. So there's a lot of worry on our end. And the other thing that really kind of there was an uptick during the pandemic is that our organization had received additional calls dealing with SA and DV issues. And so we also were really worried about some of that stuff and trying to think about how to create spaces of safety when sometimes our households aren't the safest place to be. And that is that apply for women in our community as well as particularly as well for some of our queer and trans youth in the community. And at KGA, because we center youth organizing, we work on building social and political consciousness of our young people and really uplifting the role of children in our family to educate their families and to mobilize our family in times of need. And so a lot of our work in our organization really centers supporting the solidarity that's really important in the community. And I just see I have 1 minute left. So some of the things that we've been working on, and particularly right now with a lot of the challenges with some of the anti-Asian violence and the anti-Blackness, is to think about how to center and support young people in building solidarity message as they are preparing to go back to school in the fall. And so that's some of the things that we are working on and supporting with young people right now as the summer session, Summer Organizing Institute is kicking in. And we'll be thinking about, with all the challenges in the family and in the neighborhoods, when young people go back to school, those things are going to emerge for them on school grounds, because we all know that school grounds are microcosms of larger societal issues. And so how do we get ahead of some of the challenges that might emerge? And knowing that Black and Brown youth often have some of the higher rate of discipline in school. So the type of solidarity that API youth can build with our Black and Brown youth as they are entering back into school grounds. So I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So many intersections here with youth and gender and workers, undocumented folks and families. I'm just really appreciating all four of you and just the rich experience you bring. I'm going to ask one more question. Actually, we'll go backwards. So we'll start with you again, with you, Leanne, sorry. So what is this moment calling for us to do in a different way? What would be one challenge, or you can do more than one if you want, but what's one challenge that you'd like to leave us with and really to help kick this summit off?
Thank you for that question, Rhonda. One of the things that I was really thinking about, because right now a lot of the anti-Asian violence is in the news, I just want to make sure to mention that anti-violence isn't just between individuals. The US government have been enacting anti-Asian violence for a very long time, as well as violence against other community. It is baked into how the country is governed. It is institutionalized and systemic in nature. So for example, every time a member of our community is targeted for deportation, it inflicts violence on our community. We criminalize so many things in this country, including the act to seek safety and survival for family members. Immigration and deportation are connected to the criminal justice system, just as Shiu-Ming mentioned earlier. And this is one of many reasons why solidarity is just so important between API community, Black, Brown, and Indigenous community. Our diverse communities, our immigrant and refugee communities, we all deserve dignity. We all deserve dignity, not deportation, not criminalization, not another round of displacement, and please, no more family separation. On top of everything else, this is the backdrop of what's happening to our community members during a global pandemic. Anti-Asian violence, anti-immigrant violence, and anti-Blackness will not end unless we get to the root of the problem. A challenge I like to leave us with as we kick off the summit and think about a just and equitable recovery for our community is, how can we leave the old governing system in the dust, because it hasn't been working for so many of us, and really emerge with one that shares power with our community, one that's responsive and respects all of us, and ones that lead with love. And yeah, and that, I think that's what I'm really thinking about. And I think actually you all, Manuel and your team, wrote a really great report about governing power and co-governance. And that's something that I've been really thinking deeply about with my young people and with some of our youth organizing strategy here in Long Beach. And so I'm really excited to really think about how we practice that, how we wield governing power, and how we take it. And so this is something that I hope that maybe we could think more deeply about, and a challenge that I'm really up for, and would love to see more and practice and learn it with other folks in the movement. Thank you.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you. Warmed my heart. Yes, love and responsive, respect, dignity. I love it all. Definitely. Thank you so much. Shiu-Ming, what's the challenge that you want to leave us with to kind of kick off this summit?
Yeah, I want to plus 1,000 what Leanne just said. And, I think often when we're trying to make advances, we're put into this model of scarcity and also competitiveness, where communities of color are pitted against each other, or we're told that, only a certain number of policies could pass, or that there's only a certain amount of money to go around. So the communities have to kind of pick and choose like what's most important. And I think what we have to do is to push back against that framework and really recognize the root causes of white supremacy and racial capitalism that are causing so many problems for our communities, and refuse to be pitted against each other, instead to find solidarity with each other. And so my challenge is for people to look for how we can really increase the abundance that already exists. Maybe this is a call out for like tax nerds, but it's also a shout out to the folks who've been doing really great work around people's budget in Long Beach and also LA. So thinking about like, how do we actually shift into this model of abundance, and then also make sure that we can redistribute the abundance in a way that's really equitable, and that also centers communities of color. So within that challenge, there's an opportunity, as there always is. And so hopefully we can talk more about ways to do that and make society more equitable from both the racial justice and many other perspectives.
Thank you. I love it. Let's lead with abundance, especially thinking about that huge surplus we have. Thank you so much. Marta, what challenge can you leave us with?
So thank you to Shiu-Ming and Leanne for your incredible suggestions and recommendations. I think as organizations and as a movement, we must look at racial equity as part of our day-to-day work. A lot of our organizing is centered around leadership development, developing community leaders. I think we need to develop a new type of community leader that is front and center fighting racial inequities and fighting for racial justice. Whether you suffer it yourself directly, or whether your fellow neighbor or community member suffers it, we all need to be warriors against racial inequity. And I think that we need to incorporate those guiding principles within our work and our programs and our curriculums. I think local electeds and local leaders need to be bold. We need to double down. We need to, right now, we cannot be insecure about supporting immigrant communities, about supporting programs like the LA Justice Fund. We need to make sure that this is a no-brainer and that they're real champions, not just in rhetoric, but in action. I think we need to invest in our organizations to have the resources that we need to be that safety net for the most vulnerable in the long term, to be prepared to do rapid response and not disrupt everything else that we do, but to have that capacity and that flexibility to be responsive. I think that when one segment of our population is excluded from financial support or from rights or from resources, we all suffer. The whole community suffers. It's not just about what's morally right, but what is best for our overall community. And we should think about it that way, that we all benefit from that. I think that love and solidarity, it's something that I fully believe on. Unfortunately, it's not something that we always practice. And I think that we need to really commit to the practice of love and solidarity among ourselves, among our organizations, among our community, because that is the only way that we're going to see long-lasting change.
That is so true. And that's what you said about like whether we're affected directly or indirectly, it matters to all of us. So we really need to take this seriously and really think about the wholeness of our community. Thank you so much. And we're gonna go to April, but before I wanna remind everybody, we're gonna move to questions. So if anybody has a question, please put it in the chat so our panelists can answer it. April, what challenge do you leave us with?
Sure. So I hate to sound like a broken record, but it really is, I think, the only way in the moment. I made a commitment to myself this year that I was done being a victim, that this posture that I had taken, during the pandemic was one of victimhood and of reacting. And I wanted to bring myself back to the place where I am about the fight. How do we take the fight to COVID? How do we take the fight to the system? And I don't know any other way to fight that's not centering love, centering joy, and centering abundance. And so I really want to call us to this notion that Dr. Cornel West taught us about radical love, right? That love is the ultimate act of resistance. And I just have to be clear, and everyone said it, Martha and Leanne and Shiu-Ming, like, we can't just talk about intersectionality, right? That's another one of those buzzwords. It's easy to throw around, but what does it really mean to hold my own oppression as a Black woman and center it, but at the same time, hold the oppression of others? And it is not until we stop playing the oppression Olympics, it is not until we stop saying, well, my oppression is worse than yours, and really be able to find solidarity and hold our oppression and hold each other's, right? Hold them up to the light together. It is that type of radical love, radical acceptance, radical co-conspiring, right? That will truly center love and build real partnership and create real power to change the status quo for all of us to move together.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes, let's create real power, radical co-conspiracy. I love it so much. I love it. Thank you so much, each one of you. I'm gonna actually invite Manuel and Cynthia back in so that we can have a conversation. If any questions are coming up, I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any from our audience, but you still have time. So please, if you have a question for one of our panelists, for Manuel or Cynthia, we're open. But I don't know, Manuel, do you have any questions for the panelists?
I have lots of questions for the panelists. And I just do want to say that putting together love and struggle is just so beautiful and so meaningful. And it is in that struggle that we learn to love, that when we struggle for justice, that our hearts open up and we become the kind of people that we want to be, April, that you were pointing to. Very different, empowered, not reacting, not thinking we're a minority, but understanding that we are a majority of people of color, of working people fighting for a better world. What I wanted to ask is a little bit about what you're anticipating and you really want to warn us about. I know that at the beginning of the COVID crisis, I was saying, wow, this is going to hit immigrant and people of color communities so hard. And then April, you and I were you saw me, scream at policymakers, like, what the F is wrong with you that you don't see this happening? And then, of course, the vaccine rollout was designed in a way to be inequitable by relying so much on the internet, private transportation, et cetera, et cetera. I'm particularly worried right now, as I mentioned, and several of you did, about the mental health damage that has been done by the disease, losing family members, feeling devalued because the state and the nation didn't pay sufficient attention to your communities, etc. So I'm really, really worried about that. That's something that Leanne talked about as well, and I hope that we anticipate. What are the kind of things that you're really worried about that you want us to make sure that we're anticipating? Because I kind of worry that, like, people go, well, COVID, that's done, let's go on. What worries you, and you really want to plant a flag so that we're paying attention to it? That's for any one of you. But I'll turn to Marta because she looks like she's about ready to say something.
So I want to repeat what you just said about mental health. I think our immigrant communities were already, under a lot of trauma and stress and isolation because of 4 years of another level of anti-immigrant sentiment. And on top of that, you add the pandemic and the isolation, the extreme isolation and fear that added. This is a real concern. I see it with myself. I see it with my staff. I see it with our community leaders and our community members at large and the people we serve. It is at a whole new level, so much so that we are bringing in mental health services to our space. We're partnering with local mental health providers to our space where people feel that it's a safe space that they could talk about these issues and address these issues. And also, to Leanne's comments, I've seen it a lot with our young people as well, where they, often they're at an age where maybe they don't have the tools and the know-how on how to express what they're going through, much less than an adult, for example. And so, we are seeing it very much with our youth. We also deal with recently arrived youth who have gone through a level of trauma in terms of their very dangerous journey north and their experiences in detention, which are very traumatic for our youth and are often, being put in school communities that don't address those needs. So we're pushing and advocating for school communities to be mindful of the very specific needs that these refugee kids and youth have, and to be able to provide those services at the local level. The last thing I'll say is that when there's a crisis like a pandemic, there's a lot of investment, right? There's a lot of people that are paying attention to the issue. And often what happens is that we see them for a year or 2 years, and then that's over, right? That investment goes away, that attention goes away. So I'm fearful that's what's going to happen. And that's really when we're going to feel the full impact in the economic impact to our communities, to our families, to our own organizations, is when people think, oh, okay, let's move on to the next thing. I think that needs to be looked at as a long-term investment of our communities.
April, this must be very relevant to you because I think so many of your workers that you represent were face to face with the trauma and it's traumatizing to them as well as the fragility of worker rights in any situation. Your thoughts on what we should be anticipating?
Yeah, so I think all of that is right. And but more than anything, I am really worried that we are being lulled into believing everything is okay because we have turned the corner, or we believe we have turned the corner on the economic turmoil that was a part of this pandemic, when in fact, I don't believe that we have, right? There are still far too many people that are unemployed and that are underemployed. And we are still working from the premise that government, is there to solve the problems for all, when I believe our crises in our communities are so deep, it is not just up to government to fix them. We need real collaboration between the public sector, government, private sectors, businesses, dare I say the academy, philanthropy, and the community. We got to develop new strategies where all of those groups can work together to apply resources to come up with real solutions together. We cannot just leave it up to government. And we need real change. We are applying Band-Aids to real problems that take much deeper interventions. And so, you know, here in California, oh, we have a $75 million surplus. It's not going to be forever. And like, let's make sure we are using it for lasting, deep transformational change, and not just, you know, whitewashing. And in every way you want to interpret whitewashing real deep problems.
And interestingly, the only reason why we have that $75 million surplus is because we're so unequal as a society that the stock markets went up, housing prices went up, people making more than $150,000 a year suffered almost no loss in income. You know, that money is poor people's money because it was redistributed from the poor to the wealthy. Some of it's being clawed back by taxes, but it gets looked at as a gift instead of something that people through their suffering contributed to, and it's a reflection of the deeper problems that we face as a society. Leanne, is there anything you want to say about things that we should be anticipating?
Yeah, I agree with everything that folks have said. I'm very worried about the mental health crisis and the compounded trauma. And I'm also really worried about, I feel like we have another wave of housing crisis coming up that's going to be very real, and it's going to hit many of our working families really hard. And so I really want to put that out there and that out in center, and I think we all should really think strategically about it. And you know, housing is such one of those like issue that it's just like, if we don't have housing, nothing. I mean, it's just like, what are we gonna do? There's no safety. There's nothing, right? And so it's just really, it's really difficult, and everything falls apart. And I think about like how that really impact young people, because the way in which young people were already so impacted by unstable housing just during the pandemic. What will it look like if post-pandemic we can't even get some of the housing issue? You know, we can't even fix some of that stuff. I'm really worried about it. I feel like there's a lot of stuff around that is very worrying. And the long-term investment piece that Martha mentioned, I just want to ditto that, and I think that's very important around really shifting the long-term investment, and also thinking about where we need to reinvest, where money could be taken away from, and really reinvest back into the community. And that needs to be on the table. It needs to be really discussed and really be fought for. And there's huge systemic issues and huge systems that are being funded by our tax dollars that do not need to be funded by our tax dollars. And so I think those things need to be on the table as we are thinking about recovery.
Shiu-Ming, anything that you're anticipating, want to lift up? And then I'll say a word, and Rhonda, you'll close. I think that keeps us on time.
Sure. So just to say quickly, I think one thing to anticipate is the impacts of continued climate change, whether that's droughts, more wildfires, and how that's going to affect people in terms of the ways we live, but also affect the amount of money that government has available for services. And then the other piece is like around, you know, sort of the darker side of data. You know, obviously we've been talking today about how data can really be empowering, can help us make the case for many of the campaigns and policies we're driving forward. And the flip side of that is like the increased amount of data collection, surveillance, and tracking that's happening through government, but also in conjunction with a lot of private companies. And it's not as visible as, say, seeing an ICE van or Border Patrol van driving down the street, but it is extremely dangerous in terms of the ways in which immigrants as well as citizens are being surveilled and information collected and being used to target people, also to like monitor protesters. And so thinking about like that side of surveillance and technology and where that's evolving towards is something I think we should be paying close attention to.
Well, thanks everybody for those comments. I'll pass to Rhonda, and on the way, I just wanted to say that there's a couple of different panels that I'm on where Rhonda and everybody put them together, and then Rhonda came to me and said, man, this is full of kick-ass women. And man, was this one full of kick-ass women. So all four panelists, to be sure, but also Rhonda herself as the moderator and helping to organize this event. But I wanted to honor one woman in particular, and that's Cynthia Moreno. I know who I am. You know who I am. And imagine being asked to co-present with Dr. Manuel Pastor this report. You got to be a kick-ass woman to say, I'm stepping up, I'm doing it, and I know I'm going to show, and I'm going to show blast in for justice with eloquence and with excellence. So a little bit of privilege on my part, a round of applause from all of us for Cynthia Moreno. Rhonda.
Yes, I love it. Yes, I celebrate you, Cynthia, also. And everybody, thank you so much. Leanne, April, Martha, Shiu-Ming, Manuel, Cynthia. Really appreciate your participation today, the presentation, the panel discussion. Thank you to the audience for joining. Just a note, there will be a recording of this session and every session immediately at the conclusion of the session, so you can come back and watch later. We are going to have a 10-minute break, or you can enjoy a performance by Gingy, and then we're gonna come back and have our next panel on combating white supremacy and advancing racial justice. But remember, you have to go kind of back into the app and or back to the schedule in the platform and press on it to participate. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the next panel.